Before the funeral ended, I learned my husband left me everything, and in that moment, I lost my family. They didn't look at me with love anymore, but with accusation. And what came next wasn't grief. It was war, disguised as inheritance. This is where my story begins. The day I stopped being a widow and became the threat they never expected. My name is Margaret Hale, and what you're about to hear are the echoes of a life divided between love, loss, and truth. If my story touched you, stay close. Subscribe and walk with me through every chapter. The room was too bright for morning. Morning light fell hard through the tall windows, touching silver frames and a row of untouched cups as if the house itself refused to dim for grief. They read Robert's name the way one reads a street that no longer leads anywhere, familiar but emptied of destination. It made me wonder, when a name loses its destination, does it also lose its power? My hands were still against my lap, because any movement felt like it might tear the fragile veil holding everyone together. Then they said mine. Everything. To her. It didn't sound like generosity. It sounded like the click of a door I hadn't asked to open. I felt the sentence land on each face differently. Daniel's jaw tightened. Claire's eyes lowered as though she wished to soften the floor. Emma's fingers traced the seam of her dress, searching for courage she didn't yet know she had. Nora blinked twice, the way people do when they decide to protect themselves first. And I understood that the ink on a will could turn blood into weather, something changeable, cold, and beyond debate. I had expected sorrow to be heavy and quiet, like winter snow. Instead, it came as a draft under the door, making small things feel suddenly unsafe. A chair scraping, a spoon against china, the paper-thin politeness of condolences. Everything to her filled the room like a rumor that didn't need to be spoken again. It made my children look at me as if I had been replaced by a stranger who wore my face but carried a different surname. They stopped saying mother, the way a ship stops sounding a horn when the fog clears, not in anger, but with new navigation. First, it was a tone, careful, mildly ceremonial. Then it was the name itself. Margaret. People say that names are labels. I learned they are permissions. Mother allows entry into the tender parts of a house. Margaret waits at the door. After the reading, I walked into the garden. Late roses, bruised at the edges yet stubbornly alive, leaned toward the light as if it could make them forget the season. I remembered how Robert used to cut the stems too short, insisting that flowers looked stronger that way. He wasn't wrong. He only believed that strength had to be trimmed to be seen. I slipped my hands into my coat and thought about the world we built together. The meetings arranged around his certainty, the calendars padded with my quiet repairs, the evenings when I translated his urgency into a language our children could bear. Inside, voices rose and fell like a tide that had discovered a new moon. I heard Daniel say, "She can't handle this," with the confidence of someone who thinks love and leadership are different currencies. I didn't wait to hear the defense that would not come. The garden air had a chill that kept me honest. That night, I sat at Robert's desk without asking permission from the memory of the man who used to sit there. The chair was too large, a small stage that requested a performance I had not rehearsed. Papers lay in military formation. A pen I'd given him the year our youngest finished school still carried a faint trace of his cologne. Among the documents, I found a note, one sentence written in his unhurried script. She always understood value. I thought about that word until it separated from money and returned to meaning. Value as in what is worth keeping when the storm lifts the roof. Value as in the hand that steadies the table while others argue about how to divide it. He had known, perhaps he had always known, but knowledge kept in a drawer is a promise kept too late. In the days that followed, grief dressed itself in protocol. Calls, messages, wreaths that shed petals in polite silence. "How are you holding up?" Arrived from partners who meant, "How are you holding power?" I answered with the measured warmth of someone who had learned to fold dignity into every sentence. A woman can disarm suspicion by making clarity sound like kindness. It is a skill you master when you have spent years being essential without being seen. At the first family dinner after the funeral, the table was laid like a treaty. Daniel spoke in the tone men use when they believe they are being decisive on behalf of everyone else. "We'll ensure a smooth transition," he said, eyes traveling around me as if I were an unavoidable pillar in a room he had redesigned in his head. Claire nodded because peace is her way of praying, and I love her for it even when it doesn't save us. Emma watched me the way a lighthouse watches water, steady, but alert for rocks no one else admits are there. I folded my napkin slowly and said little. Silence is not surrender, it is reconnaissance. How many times have you stayed silent just to learn who would fill the silence for you? When the guests were gone, I walked the corridor lined with photographs Robert loved. In one frame, the anniversary portrait, he stands forward, bright as a promise. I am half a step behind, hand on his arm, eyes on the camera that never really noticed me. It had always seemed romantic. Two people, one shadow, one light. That night, the composition looked like a map I no longer intended to follow. At his desk again, I opened the bottom drawer, the one that stuck. A thin envelope had slid to the back as if it were hiding from time. Inside were copies of training schedules, notes from meetings he and I had planned together, margins filled with his questions and my answers. He had traced certain phrases twice. Risk in Q3 tied to supply, reputation long tail. Listen to her. I could hear his voice in the rhythm of the page. He had been preparing the ground in his own way, like a man planting trees he never expects to sit under. I wasn't angry that he hadn't told the children. I was angry that he assumed the right season would announce itself. The morning I took my first call as the one who decides, I understood the difference between authority and authorship. Authority is what others let you hold. Authorship is what you take responsibility for creating. The voice on the line belonged to a board member who had attended more weddings than meetings. He cleared his throat, searching for a tone that could combine condolence with mild doubt. "We're here to support you, of course," he said, the way someone compliments a passenger while casually asking for the wheel. I answered with measured courtesy and a request for numbers that would take him a week to compile. A mother asks how you are feeling. A leader asks where the holes are. There is a strange thing that happens when you step into a room people did not expect you to own. History clears its throat. Men remember how their fathers did it. Women remember the invisible labor that made it possible. You walk to the head of the table, and the air changes shape around your shoulders. The chairs whisper, "Are you sure?" The windows ask, "Will you still open us when the storm makes a mess of the curtains?" That afternoon, Clara brought tea to the study and lingered as if tea could stay courage. "Mrs. Hale," she said softly, and the title felt both merciful and heavy. I looked at the clock and realized how long I'd been holding my breath, counting seconds between strategies, inhaling only to stay polite. I think that is when I first sensed the outline of the battle ahead, not for profit, not for legacy, but for language. For how they would speak to me, and therefore how they would allow themselves to see me. Inheritance, I learned, is not a gift. It is a mirror that chooses its own lighting. Stand before it and you will see not what you are, but what others believe you must be to make them comfortable. I didn't want the empire. I wanted the respect to decline or accept without having to explain my pulse. A week later, the requests to take it slow arrived wrapped in friendly paper. "For your sake," they said, and I politely placed each ribboned doubt into a box labeled "Later." Because there are seasons when the only way to honor love is to refuse the version of yourself love has trained you to be. I wiped the desk, aligned the pens, opened the window to let the day argue with the drapes, and said aloud to a room that would repeat my words only to me, "Breathe, hands steady. Truth is shield." I wish I could tell you that the house understood, that the portraits relaxed, that the floor remembered the weight of my steps from years of carrying everyone else. But the house learned at the speed of people, which is to say, slowly and with resistance. The first meeting with the board was scheduled for Friday. Daniel asked to lead for optics. I let the request travel the air between us and disappear. Optics are useful to those who still depend on mirrors. I had long ago learned to read the room by listening to what the windows refused to reflect. On the night before that meeting, Emma found me in the study. She didn't say, "Mother." She said, "Are you warm enough?" A sentence that held more love than protection. I told her yes, though my fingers were colder than the porcelain cup I kept refilling and forgetting to drink. She reached for my hand, and for a moment I was simply a woman who had lost a man she loved, not a figure people debated like a line item. When she left, I looked again at Robert's note. She always understood value. I placed it where I could see it, not as proof for them, but as a compass for me. And there, between the paper and the window, it came to me as plainly as a doorbell. The true test would not be whether I could lead the company. It would be whether I could stay myself while everyone tried to rename me. The meeting was hours away. The house held its breath with me. Somewhere in the city, signatures were being practiced, proposals rehearsed, stories sharpened to cut the shape of truth they preferred. I ran my thumb along the edge of the note until it no longer felt like paper, but like a key. The kind you carry quietly, waiting for the right lock to admit it was built for your hand. The church smelled of lilies and varnish, that peculiar mixture of beauty and polish that only grief can make sacred. Outside, the wind rattled the iron gate, impatient, like someone waiting for the truth to finally leave the building. Inside, people whispered in the way they do when the silence belongs to someone else. I stood by the front pew, not as widow, not yet as heir, but as something in between, a witness to the way affection turns into memory. Robert's photograph rested on the coffin, his smile too certain for a man who had left so many questions behind. When Daniel arrived, his handshake was firm and quick. "We'll handle everything," he said, as though I were an elderly guest at my own farewell. I nodded, because funerals are not for correcting the living. They're for forgiving what the living couldn't change. "Tell me, who do you think forgiveness really serves?" Claire followed, face pale and cautious, as if carrying a secret she didn't choose. Emma came last, clutching her small Bible like a fragile promise. She kissed my cheek and whispered, "He's at peace now." I wanted to believe her, but peace is never a shared inheritance. During the service, Reverend Whitmore spoke of legacy, of love that builds more than it owns. His words landed softly, but I could feel Daniel's restlessness beside me, the tapping of his thumb against his knee, the impatience of someone who confuses grief with inconvenience. When the Reverend said, "Her strength was his compass," Daniel's jaw tightened. Nora's glance followed, brief and calculating. After the ceremony, I stayed behind. People filed out, carrying umbrellas and unspoken judgments. The rain began, polite at first, then deliberate. I could hear Clara's footsteps approaching, that familiar rhythm of loyalty wrapped in worry. "You should rest, Mrs. Hale," she said, holding out my coat. "Rest?" I smiled faintly. That sounds like something other people can afford to do. She hesitated. "They'll come to you soon. Questions, arrangements." "I know," I replied. "They already have the tone rehearsed." We drove home in silence. The house felt larger than it had the day before, as if grief had stretched the walls. The portraits along the staircase looked newly framed, the faces more watchful. I could almost hear Robert's voice in the creak of the floorboards, his habit of pacing while thinking, his sighs of approval or concern. I wanted to speak to him once more, not to ask why he left the empire to me, but why he thought they would forgive him for it. Maybe I wanted to ask something smaller, whether he ever doubted me, the way everyone else now does. That evening the children gathered in the dining room. The candles flickered, tall and judgmental. Daniel began without looking at me. "There's a matter we should clarify about the company," he said. "The board expects a transition plan." "A transition," I repeated, tasting the word as if it were a fruit I didn't trust. "It's not personal," Nora added quickly. "It's just practical." Claire's eyes darted between us. "Maybe we can divide responsibilities, at least for now." Emma's voice was quiet but steady. "Mother is capable of more than any of you think." The air turned fragile. Daniel smiled, a lawyer's smile composed of patience and concealed offense. "This isn't about capability," he said. "It's about image. Investors expect stability." I looked at him, my son who once built castles out of my notebooks and now built walls with his words. "Then perhaps stability is not what they need," I said calmly. "Perhaps they need truth." No one answered. The clock filled the silence, its rhythm a steady reminder that time only respects those who listen to it. I excused myself before the conversation could finish wounding itself. Upstairs, the light in Robert's study still glowed, as if waiting for me to complete a sentence he never finished. I opened the drawer again, the one with his handwriting. The margin of an old document caught my attention. Tiny notes written in pencil, smudged but legible. "She sees what I miss." Beneath it, another line. "Trust her judgment when I cannot be there." My breath caught halfway. Not because of the words themselves, but because I realized he had left breadcrumbs, small proofs scattered through his papers, waiting for me to gather them when the house turned cold. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound carried meaning: the ticking clock, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the sigh of old wood adjusting to rain. I remembered Robert's last months, the meetings he took from home, the gentle way he asked about my opinion, not out of courtesy, but conviction. Maybe he had been teaching me without saying it aloud. Maybe the inheritance wasn't sudden. It was the conclusion of a quiet apprenticeship neither of us dared to name. The next morning, a courier delivered a stack of letters for me to sign. Among them, a note from Daniel, polite and pointed. "Board meeting Monday. Let's align expectations." I read it twice, the ink too neat to trust. "Expectations," I murmured. That word had always been the leash disguised as kindness. Clara entered carrying tea. "You've been up all night again," she said. "I'm learning to sleep differently," I replied. "Less rest, more awareness." She smiled sadly. "He'd be proud of you." I don't know if pride is what I need from him anymore. I walked to the window. The garden was soaked, petals scattered across the stone path like the aftermath of a polite storm. Somewhere beyond the fence, life was already continuing. The world rarely pauses for private wars. I touched the glass, cold and clean, and whispered the words I'd been afraid to admit aloud. They loved me as long as I stayed small. It wasn't bitterness, it was inventory. Love, after all, is measured not by what it gives, but by what it permits. Behind me, the house seemed to breathe, its silence thick with anticipation. I turned off the lamp, gathered Robert's papers, and placed them into a neat stack. Each page was both evidence and inheritance, proof that he saw me, not as an ornament to his empire, but as its architect. And for the first time since the will was read, I felt something steadier than grief, something shaped like resolve. Outside, thunder rolled across the hills, low and deliberate. It sounded like an agreement being written in the sky. By Monday morning, the rain had left a thin film of silver across the windows. It blurred the world just enough to make it look almost forgiving. Inside, the house hummed with a different kind of quiet, the kind that waits for confrontation. I dressed carefully, black wool, understated pearls, hair tied back. I didn't choose those things for vanity. They were armor that looked polite. In the mirror, I studied the reflection not as a woman preparing for a meeting, but as someone stepping into contested territory. Power never knocks. It arrives disguised as duty and stays as long as no one asks who invited it. When I entered the boardroom, they were already seated. Men who had toasted Robert 100 times, who now looked at me as though I were a temporary guest at his table. Daniel stood near the window, back straight, a man rehearsing leadership. "Mother," he said, the word carrying the weight of negotiation. "Let's keep this brief. There's a proposal to appoint an interim director just until we stabilize." "Stabilize," I repeated, letting the word rest on the air like a coin waiting to see which side lands up. I wasn't aware we were unstable. Nora shifted in her chair. "It's not about instability," she said. "It's optics. Investors trust continuity." "And yet," I replied, "continuity doesn't always mean repeating the same mistakes." A few faces turned down, studying their notes. Others exchanged glances heavy with the politics of sympathy. Daniel smiled, that polite, brittle kind of smile that hides the fear of losing control. "This isn't personal, Mother. It's just a transition." I almost admired his phrasing. It was the same tone Robert used when ending negotiations, calm, deliberate, final. But Daniel didn't yet know that control isn't about volume. It's about silence that others can't read. When the meeting ended, they stood in clusters, whispering, pretending to review figures. I walked past them slowly, feeling the cold air that always fills a room after something invisible breaks. Outside, the corridor smelled faintly of varnish and paper, like the aftermath of a confession. Back home, I found a message waiting, an official notice from the bank. My personal account temporarily frozen due to administrative review. The phrase was too bureaucratic to be innocent. I sat down, reread the letter, and allowed myself one small laugh, not of amusement, of recognition. The empire was moving against its new queen, using rules as weapons. I called Clara. "Would you check whether the office accounts are affected?" She nodded, already reading my tone. "Of course. And if they are? Then we'll treat it as a signal, not a setback." That night I couldn't sleep. The ceiling was a pale expanse of memory. I thought of Robert's voice on late evenings, discussing balance sheets and staff disputes, always ending with the same line. "You see more than you say." At the time, it sounded like a compliment. Now, it felt like an inheritance disguised as instruction. I rose before dawn and went to his study. Dust had begun to gather on the edge of his books, the way time begins to gather on truth when no one speaks it. I opened the bottom drawer again. This time, I noticed a hidden compartment beneath the false lining, a small wooden space that yielded after a moment's pressure. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied with twine and a leather notebook, corners worn by use. The first page was dated nearly 2 years before his death. Notes for succession review. My pulse quickened. He had been preparing this quietly. Names, projections, brief remarks. Daniel, strategic but impulsive. Claire, empathetic yet hesitant. Emma, moral clarity, emotional compass. Margaret sees total picture. Her insight. My throat tightened. For a long moment I simply held the page, feeling the weight of what it meant. He had chosen me long before the will. He just hadn't found a way to make them ready for it. Among the papers was an old recording device, one of those small dictaphones he used for memos. I pressed play. His voice emerged, slightly distorted, yet alive enough to make my heart stutter. "If you're hearing this," he began, "then the transition has reached her. She'll know what to do. Trust her judgment. She always understood value." I sat there, still as the furniture. The words didn't feel like comfort. They felt like orders from the past, reminders that love sometimes entrusts you with a war it couldn't finish. By mid-morning, I was back at the office. The receptionist avoided my eyes, a small act of allegiance to whoever promised stability. I walked past her gently, as though her silence were a fragile glass I didn't intend to shatter. In the conference room, I spread Robert's notes across the table. I wanted to see his logic, to trace how a man known for control had decided to hand the compass to his wife. Clara brought tea, hesitant. "You should eat," she said softly. "I will," I murmured, scanning a page. After I understand the battlefield. She looked at the papers. Do you trust them? I paused. I trust people to protect their interests. That's often enough to predict their next move. Outside, the city was waking, the hum of engines, the echo of heels on stone. Inside, the empire was already shifting, realigning itself like a chessboard after a queen's unexpected move. Later that afternoon, Daniel called. His tone was bright, falsely casual. Mother, just a misunderstanding about the accounts. I'll fix it. No need, I replied. It's already being reviewed. A pause. By whom? By me. He exhaled through his nose, the sound of a man realizing his narrative had slipped from his grasp. You don't understand how these systems work. I do, I said softly. I just understand why they were built. When the call ended, I allowed myself a long breath. Hands steady, I whispered, echoing the refrain that had carried me through the past days. That night, the house felt different. The air had lost its grief and gained in tension. In the living room, the portrait of Robert seemed to shift under the dim light, as though approving from a distance. I thought about Daniel, his pride, his fear, and wondered when exactly love turns into rivalry. Perhaps at the first moment, someone sees your strength and mistakes it for disobedience. Before bed, I wrote a note in my journal. The empire isn't inherited, it's revealed. And with that, I realized that truth has its own form of power. It doesn't need to be declared, only demonstrated. The next morning brought a message from Samuel Alden. It contained just one line. Meet me at the old office tomorrow. I found something Robert wanted you to have. I closed my eyes and let the words settle. For the first time since the funeral, I felt the faint pull of direction, not the weight of duty, but the spark of investigation. Whatever Robert had left behind, I would find it. And whatever they feared I might discover, I was already halfway there. The next day began with a sound I hadn't heard in weeks, laughter. It drifted up from the kitchen, light but nervous, like the early notes of a storm unsure of itself. Clara was talking to one of the maids, her voice lowered to a careful cheerfulness. The kind women practice when they know the house is listening. I descended the stairs slowly. The air smelled faintly of lemon oil and old paper, Robert's scent, resurrected by memory. On the hallway console, the morning newspaper lay folded in half. My name was printed in the finance section. Widow assumes control of Hale Group amid family concerns. The words stung less than the subheading. Transition sparks debate among investors. I ran a fingertip over the ink. It came off dark on my skin, like proof of something that didn't need proving. For a moment, I saw the headline as Daniel must have seen it, a challenge disguised as pity. The day was heavy with preparation. The quarterly luncheon with the board and key shareholders, an event Robert once commanded with a mix of warmth and intimidation. This time, Daniel insisted on hosting it. It'll look more unified, he said. His tone carried the same practiced care one uses before setting a trap. When I arrived, the hall was already filled with voices, the clinking of glasses, the polite collisions of ambition. Every table carried an arrangement of white roses and pale hydrangeas, Robert's favorites. Tradition, I realized, can be the most elegant disguise for exclusion. Nora greeted me with a smile sharpened by restraint. You look lovely, she said. Robert would be proud to see you keeping up appearances. Appearances, I repeated softly. They've always been our family's strongest currency. Daniel appeared moments later, immaculate in his dark suit. Mother, he said, guiding me toward the main table. I thought it best if you sat beside Mr. Atkins. He's handling investor relations now. I met his gaze. That used to be my role. He smiled, a fraction too wide. Yes, times change. The luncheon unfolded like theater. Toasts, speeches, the ritual choreography of respect. I noticed how the conversation avoided my direction unless Daniel steered it there. Questions about projections were addressed to him, even when they referenced decisions I had made years earlier. When one of the older partners mentioned a restructuring plan Robert had left unfinished, Daniel's hand brushed the tablecloth in a subtle warning. "She wasn't involved in those details," he said smoothly. "Father preferred to keep the technical aspects separate." For a second, the sound in the room seemed to fade. The clatter of forks dulled. The background music became a hum. I didn't speak. I simply inhaled, long, measured, deliberate. Silence can draw more attention than outrage ever could. Do you think calm is power, or just the mask we wear when anger would cost too much? I lifted my glass, not in protest but in presence. "Actually," I said quietly, "Robert discussed that plan with me the month before he fell ill. He wanted to reduce exposure, not expand it. A subtle difference, but a meaningful one." Eyes turned. Daniel's expression froze for a fraction of a second, barely perceptible, but I caught it. Then came the practiced smile. "Of course, Mother," he replied. I stand corrected. The room relaxed, polite laughter filling the air again. Yet beneath the surface, I could feel the temperature shift. My calm had unsettled him more than any argument could have. Still, I left the table early. Power games are never won in front of witnesses. They're decided in silence afterward. Outside, the corridor stretched long and echoing. My reflection followed me in the glass panels, composed, deliberate, a woman walking away from her own dismissal. I passed a window and paused. The sky was the color of steel before rain. For a moment, I felt the urge to cry, not from humiliation, but from the exhaustion of staying still while being erased. Back home, I poured myself a glass of water. My hands trembled, and I steadied them on the counter. "Breathe," I told myself. "Hands steady, truth as shield." The same words Robert had once said when signing a contract that could have cost everything. The phone rang. It was Samuel Alden. His voice carried the weight of quiet loyalty. "I found something," he said. "A sealed folder. Robert asked me to hold it in case. Circumstances required clarity." "Clarity," I repeated. "It seems we could use some." "Come by my office tomorrow," he continued. "Discretion would be wise." When the call ended, I leaned against the window and looked out into the garden. The roses had lost most of their petals, but the stems still held upright, defiant against the coming cold. Strength, I realized, doesn't always bloom. It endures. That night, Daniel called. His tone was clipped, irritated. "You embarrassed me today," he said. "I corrected an error," I answered, "in front of investors, where errors matter most." A silence followed, thick and sharp. Then his voice softened, too quickly. "I just want what's best for the company." "I believe you," I said. "The question is whether the company believes in you." He hung up before I could hear him breathe. I stared at the receiver for a long time, the ghost of his pride still humming through the line. Later, I found myself in Robert's study again. The faint smell of cedar and dust clung to the books. On the desk lay the letters I had discovered, his handwriting looping across the pages with the patience of a man who trusted time more than explanation. I opened one at random. "If she doubts herself, remind her that patience is not weakness, it's strategy." I smiled faintly. "You always planned ahead," I whispered, "even for my doubts." I stayed up until dawn, reviewing everything. Letters, ledgers, minutes of old meetings. The more I read, the more the pattern revealed itself. Quiet guidance, subtle protections, pieces of a larger truth Robert had built in plain sight. He hadn't simply left me the empire. He had built it with me all along. They just hadn't noticed. When morning light seeped through the curtains, I felt something I hadn't felt in months, composure without fear. Grief had been my disguise. Now it was becoming my armor. I called Clara and asked for a pot of tea. "You're up early again," she said gently. "Not early," I replied. "Just ready." The day ahead would not be kind. But kindness, I had learned, was often the language of control. What I needed was clarity, and the courage to speak it softly enough that only truth could hear. I gathered Robert's papers into a single folder, bound them with a ribbon, and placed them in my bag. The time for silence had passed. The investigation had begun, not into the company, but into the inheritance of perception itself. Tomorrow I would meet Samuel, and perhaps, for the first time since Robert's death, I would understand why his final note ended not with a farewell, but with a sentence that felt like prophecy. She always understood value. Samuel's office sits above a bookstore that smells of linen paper and quiet afternoons. It has the kind of staircase that insists you hold the rail, not because you might fall, but because it wants you to remember that ascent is something you do with intention. I arrived before opening. The street was still damp from last night's rain. The awning held small pearls of water that dropped one by one, a metronome for the morning. He opened the door himself. No secretary, no performance, just Samuel and that patient gaze of his, the look of a man who listens for what people do not say. "I'm sorry for the hour," he began. "Sorry is a word for accidents," I said. "This feels deliberate." He gestured to the inner room. The desk was immaculate, except for a brown envelope with my name on it, written in Robert's hand. Seeing those letters, M-A-R-G, unearthed a tremor I had carefully buried. For a moment, I was at our kitchen table again, watching Robert address invitations with the stubborn elegance of someone who liked paper more than screens. "Go ahead," Samuel said. I broke the seal. Inside lay a series of documents, a letter dated 6 months before Robert's diagnosis, notarized, outlining his intention for me to assume leadership if his health declined. Minutes from an off-cycle board consultation where he presented a contingency plan, a legal memo confirming my authority in the event of dispute, and at the bottom, a smaller envelope with a single key and a handwritten line, "Vault, 3rd drawer, back panel." The breath left my body slowly, as if it had to remember the way out. Samuel watched without interrupting. "He gave me that after a meeting none of the children attended," he said. "Said he wanted one person who wasn't family to know where the truth could be found." "Truth," I repeated. Such an inconvenient guest. "He knew this would be contested," Samuel continued. "He also knew you wouldn't ask for help unless the house was already on fire." "I would have preferred rain," I said. He smiled sadly. "Rain can be postponed. Fire writes its own calendar." I looked again at the notarized letter. Robert's signature held steady, the pen pressing firmly into the paper as if he wanted to pin the future down. A line beneath it read, "She understands value. She will protect the people before the numbers." I touched the ink with the back of my knuckle, the way you touch the forehead of a sleeping child. "There's more," Samuel said. He opened a drawer and placed a small recorder on the desk. "He asked me to hold this too." I pressed play. Robert's voice filled the room, warmer than the October light, imperfect enough to be real. "If you're hearing this, it means the season has changed sooner than I hoped. Margaret, it will be difficult. Daniel will lead with pride, Claire with peace, Emma with heart. You must lead with all three. Remember, sometimes the cleanest act of love is to refuse a comfortable lie." I didn't cry. Not because I was strong, but because the recording demanded stillness, as if movement might distort it into something else. When it ended, the silence felt like a bell that had just rung. "I'll need copies," I said. "They're already made," Samuel replied, sliding a folder toward me. "And one more thing." He placed a thin flash drive next to the recorder. "It contains voice memos Robert recorded during strategy sessions with you. He labeled them by date and topic. If anyone questions whether you were part of the core decision-making, these will make it plain." Thank you," I said, and the words felt inadequate. Gratitude can be too small for the size of what it tries to hold. "Be careful," he said, walking me to the door. "People don't like to discover that a story has a different author than the one they've been praising." I don't intend to gloat, I told him. I didn't say you would, he replied, but truth makes its own enemies. I left the office and walked into a city already impatient with the day. The sun found a path between two buildings and laid a narrow ribbon of gold across the street. I stood in it for a moment, letting it stripe my coat, and thought, light needs only a crack. I had one now. Back home, I went straight to Robert's study. The vault sat behind the cabinet of leather-bound reports, one of those safes engineered to look ordinary. The key fit as if it had been waiting in my pocket all along. Inside the third drawer, at the back, a panel slid under my thumb and revealed a flat compartment. 2 items, a slim black binder and a folded piece of paper. The binder carried a title in Robert's handwriting, almost playful in its understatement, "In case they forget who you are." The paper was a copy of the contingency plan, countersigned by 2 board members whose admiration for Robert occasionally masqueraded as independence. I opened the binder. It began with a letter to me. If you are reading this, then you are about to be misnamed. They will call you lucky, impulsive, naive, sentimental. Keep a record of what you do, not to justify, but to remember. When the room tries to reduce you, let your own notes refuse the shrinking. You once told me love is a ledger you balance with mercy. Lead that way, even if they never learn the math. Pages followed, meeting agendas annotated in 2 hands, my suggestions circled, outcomes recorded. There were even printed emails from vendors and partners who had dealt with me directly, their language respectful and specific. Robert had been documenting not only decisions, but my authorship of them. Proofs, yes, but also a portrait. It felt like being seen in a language the world rarely speaks for women, the language of credit. I made tea and read until the kettle sighed itself empty. Each page reassembled a marriage the outside world had never fully understood. A partnership not of dominance and support, but of alternating lead and harmony. The binder was both evidence and love letter, the kind that prefers quarrels with truth over peace with illusion. The house felt different around noon. Sunlight climbed the wall and softened the frames of photographs that used to ignore me. I took out a notebook and began my own list. Operations I had optimized, contracts I had saved from vanity, hires I had insisted on over promising young men with excellent pedigrees. It wasn't ego. It was inventory, an honest count before the audit of other people's opinions. When the phone rang, I was ready for disappointment and found it waiting. The bank reported my accounts restored. A standard verification issue. Standard is the adjective people use when they want you to feel foolish for noticing a pattern. I asked for the timestamps of the freeze and the release. They hesitated. I repeated the question with a kindness that took no prisoners. The numbers arrived by email before I set the receiver down. The freeze had followed the luncheon by 2 hours. The release came 20 minutes after Daniel's call to me that night. I forwarded the data to our legal counsel with a single sentence. Please keep on file. Facts don't need speeches, they need shelves. By mid-afternoon, my pulse had found a new rhythm. Faster, but not frantic. I told Clara I would be at the office until late. She glanced at the folder in my hand and nodded the way soldiers do when uniforms are traded for plain clothes. I'll have broth ready when you return, she said. Victory is hungry work. Let's not name it yet, I replied. Let's just feed the day. At the office, the receptionist offered a smile that stumbled. I didn't rescue it. In the conference room, I laid out the documents. Samuel's copies, the notarized letter, the contingency plan, the voice memos indexed with dates. I played one quietly, just to hear the texture of intent in Robert's voice. Margaret thinks we're underestimating the reputational risk, he said. She's usually right when she uses that word. Adjust the plan and run it by her. I wasn't tempted to broadcast it yet. There's an art to letting truth arrive on time. Too soon, and it feels like vengeance. Too late, and it sounds like excuse. I wanted neither. When Daniel entered, he didn't knock. He looked at the array on the table and found the expression men wear when they realize the board no longer tilts in their favor. "What is all this?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. "Clarity," I said. "Mother, you can't just rummage through fathers." "These were left for me," I said, calm as a leveled string. "And for the board, if necessary." He picked up the contingency plan, scanned the signatures, blinked. "Why didn't he?" "Because he loved you," I said. "Because he believed time would teach you gently. But time can be a cruel tutor when you skip the lesson." He set the paper down. "This doesn't change the optics." "No," I agreed. "It changes the facts. Optics will follow when facts stop being politely ignored." For a moment he looked young again, my boy who used to run too fast down hills and skin his knees because stopping felt like defeat. Then the executive returned. "The board has called a special session," he said. "Friday. They want to discuss leadership. It's standard procedure." "Standard," I murmured, and allowed myself the ghost of a smile. "Then we'll follow procedure." He hesitated at the door. "You're making this harder than it has to be." "I am making it exactly as hard as truth requires." When he left, I sat alone with the documents and the quiet hum of the building. The window showed a city drawn in graphite and light. I remembered the first time Robert took me to this office as more than a wife, years ago, when a distribution deal had soured and tempers wanted a sacrifice. He'd asked me to listen, not to speak. Afterward, in the elevator, he had said, "You draw a map when you listen. Most people draw a weapon." He had loved me for that. Now I would have to love our family with the same discipline, even if they mistook it for war. The days between Tuesday and Friday stretched like wire. I spent them in preparation that looked, from a distance, like stillness. I met privately with 2 board members who had witnessed Robert's contingency discussion. They remembered the meeting. They remembered my questions. They remembered their respect, though they hadn't said it aloud at the time. Silence can be loyal to the wrong thing. I asked them to read the documents and tell me if they recognized themselves in the record. Both did. One signed a brief statement. The other said, "If it comes to a vote, I won't embarrass myself by pretending I didn't know who was doing the work." I slept in fragments. Between those thin pieces of night, I wrote. Not speeches. Those are for people who need applause. I wrote sentences that could carry weight without raising their voice. I wrote questions for the finance team that required numbers, not feelings. I wrote the names of employees whose livelihoods had been stabilized by decisions I had quietly insisted upon. Not as ammunition, as a compass. When people forget why a house stands, you must recall the blueprints. On Thursday evening, Emma visited. She brought a small plant in a clay pot, the kind that looks unimpressive until it chooses a window and surprises you in spring. "It's for your office," she said. "Something alive that isn't paperwork." I placed it on the sill, where the last amber of daylight could rest on its leaves. "You've always known where to put light," I told her. She hesitated at the door. "They're going to push hard tomorrow." "I know." "Do you need me there?" she asked. I thought about it. "I need you to be yourself," I said. "It's the one role no one can counterfeit." She smiled, brave and gentle. "Then I'll pray not for victory, but for clarity." "Pray for both," I said. "Sometimes clarity is victory." When she left, I turned off the desk lamp and let the city's glow take over. Shadows arranged themselves into honest shapes. I collected the documents into a leather portfolio and placed the recorder on top. The sound of the clasp closing seemed louder than it should have been, like a gavel in a small courtroom. That night, sleep finally came. I dreamt of the old house by the coast where Robert and I once spent a winter adjusting to marriage. In the dream, the windows stuck and I had to shoulder them open. Cold air rushed in, but with it came a view, an unfettered horizon that made the room larger than its walls. I woke with the taste of salt on my tongue and understood. Some windows don't yield to requests. They respond to insistence. Friday arrived dressed in a quiet that felt ceremonial. I chose a navy suit, not black. Black is for grief, navy is for resolve. I pinned a small silver brooch to my lapel, a gift from Robert after our first successful year, a circle with a thin line through it. Balance, he'd called it. Not perfection, just balance. At the elevator, I caught my reflection and saw neither widow nor interloper. I saw a woman who had finally stopped asking permission from rooms she kept clean. The boardroom was colder than usual. Someone had adjusted the thermostat, perhaps to ensure that discomfort could be blamed on air rather than tension. Members took their seats with careful choreography. Daniel sat at the end opposite me, as if distance could behave like authority. The chair cleared his throat. "We're here to discuss leadership," he began. "Given recent events, it seems reasonable to consider an interim arrangement." I waited until silence had fully arrived before speaking. "Before we consider arrangements," I said, "I'd like to ensure we're considering facts." I placed the portfolio on the table and opened it, not dramatically, just enough to invite attention. The notarized letter, the contingency plan, the statements from the 2 board members, a 1-page timeline of decisions made in the last 2 years, annotated with Robert's notes and my contributions. I slid the recorder forward and pressed play. Robert's voice did the rest, not pleading, not commanding, merely recognizing. You could feel the room exhale. Some eyes softened, others hardened. A few drifted toward Daniel and quickly away, as if his composure might be contagious. When the recording ended, I spoke in the tone I used when teaching the children to cross busy streets. Even, firm, kind. "Leadership is not a favor," I said. "It's a debt you agree to pay daily, with interest. If anyone here believes I cannot pay it, say so now, and let us place our reasons beside our records." No one spoke for several beats. Then, from the far end, a hand lifted. Not Daniel's. "Mr. Atkins, Investor Relations," the man who had been seated next to me at the luncheon, the man Daniel hoped would translate my competence into his comfort. "I remember those memos," he said slowly. "I also remember ignoring some of them because I thought I knew better. The cost of that mistake is still on our balance sheet." The chair adjusted his glasses. "Are we prepared to vote?" Daniel straightened. "Before we vote, I'd like to ask a question." He turned to me, voice calm, almost gentle. "If Father intended all of this, why didn't he say it plainly to the family?" "Because he believed love could do the heavy lifting," I answered. "He hoped it wouldn't need a microphone." "And you?" he asked. "What do you believe?" I looked at my son, the boy who once returned a lost wallet because money spends better when it's honest. "I believe love is not a reason to lie," I said. "Not to others, not to ourselves." Silence again. Then the chair nodded. "We'll proceed." They distributed ballots. Pens scratched. The clock on the wall marked seconds that felt like months. I folded my hands, not in prayer, not in defiance, simply to remind myself that trembling belongs to muscles, not to truth. When the results were tallied, the chair cleared his throat. "By a clear majority, we affirm Mrs. Hale's leadership as outlined in the succession plan." A sound moved through the room like fabric settling. Some relief, some reluctance. Daniel stared at the table. Nora looked at the window. Claire closed her eyes. I didn't look at Emma. I knew she would be crying quietly, the way she cries when goodness wins without applause. I thanked the board and stood. There were handshakes. There were phrases so polished they refused to reveal what they meant. I gathered the documents and the recorder, placed them back in the portfolio, and felt its weight change from burden to instrument. In the hallway, the air was warmer. The receptionist offered a smile that didn't stumble this time. I didn't hold it up. I returned it. At the elevator, Daniel caught up to me. He didn't speak until the doors closed. "So this is how it is," he said. "This is how it always was," I replied. "We just stopped pretending otherwise." He looked at me, eyes searching for a version of me he preferred. Finding none, he said, I hope you know what you're doing. I do, I said, but I also know what I won't do. And what's that? Trade the people for the numbers. The doors opened. I stepped out. He didn't follow. Back in my office, the little plant Emma brought had found the light and angled itself accordingly. I stood by the window and watched the city at mid-afternoon. Somewhere below, traffic argued with patience and lost. I touched the glass and felt its cool certainty. The empire wasn't a crown. It was a house with many rooms, some of which I had built while others took credit for the view. I took the silver brooch off my lapel and placed it on the desk. For a moment, I saw my life as a ledger, debits of grief, credits of truth, and somewhere a line titled Dignity that needed no calculation. I thought of Robert's last note and of Samuel's quiet help, and of the way love sometimes fails to teach what only loss can. I thought of Daniel's question and how motherhood changes shape when power enters the room. You become both the door and the threshold. Evening crept in and lingered like someone reluctant to leave. I turned on the lamp and wrote a single sentence on a fresh page. Let the windows stay open. Then I closed the portfolio and slid it into the drawer. Not hidden, available. The phone rang once and stopped. A text followed from an unknown number. You may have won today, but the story isn't over. No signature. I stared at it without surprise. Stories worth living never are. I locked the office and walked into the corridor where the lights hummed like a quiet vow. Somewhere, in the belly of the building, the cleaning staff was beginning their shift, the faithful restoration that allows the next day to pretend it's spotless. I thought of Clara's broth waiting at home and of the garden that would demand pruning soon. Empires and roses, both require the sharpness you handle carefully or not at all. On the steps outside, night had fully arrived. The air was crisp, the kind that makes your breath visible. I descended slowly, each step a small agreement with the ground. Across the street, a child tugged his mother's hand, impatient to cross before the light changed. She held him back, gentle and firm. When it turned green, they went together. I smiled. Then I walked toward the car, knowing that tomorrow would bring its own tests, its own letters, its own attempts to rename what had finally introduced itself. And still, a question lingered, one that refused to resolve itself as neatly as a vote. When a family decides that respect is conditional, what keeps love from becoming another kind of currency?